Hello, I'm Dr. Anna Ruchtsman, and it's a pleasure to be here with you, albeit virtually today. I am an assistant professor of law at St. Louis University Center for Health Law Studies and International and Comparative Law, and I'll be um, performing that role for the remainder of this week. And then next week, I become professor of law at Villanova University, also in the United States in the Philadelphia area. So if you're ever in the Philadelphia area, I welcome you there. And in particular, Dr. Chohan, the author of this wonderful book that we're celebrating today, we hope to host you at some point should you come to the United States. I'm positive you'd find audiences that are very interested in what you have to say and your very comprehensive work on this topic. So without further ado, I'm going to do my part for today, which is provide a very brief introduction to the book, and I prepared some slides. So I'm going to share my screen with you. So here we go. And obviously, you are by now, I hope, familiar with the book, which is incredibly timely, and it intersects with so many areas, scholarly and practical areas that have invested a lot of time and effort in understanding how we can deal better with the next pandemic, which we know is going to happen, unfortunately, and probably before not too long, as pandemics do. But also, we can prepare better for public health crises, which, as Dr. Chohan points out throughout the book, are not merely public health crises. They also take a toll on multiple other areas. And that's one of the contributions, one of the many contributions of this book. These are just some of the highlights that I found throughout the book. As I mentioned in my brief introduction, I'm a law professor, and I work also with policy issues, mainly from a public health perspective. So these bullet points are not meant to encapsulate everything that the book does, which is a whole lot. I'm just highlighting a few things that resonated in particular with me, and that I suspect will resonate with people in the public health law and policy space. And even though I have never worked myself with public value theory, I could not highlight the contribution of the book in this area, because it helps to populate the nascent field, and one that is providing very useful frameworks for us to understand where preparedness for upcoming health crisis might be experiencing some problems. So it's more than a theoretical approach that Dr. Chohan highlights comprehensively in the chapter on public value, but also throughout the book. I really think this is a tool to understand what has gone wrong and what can go better and prepare better for pandemics. It is something we we desperately need to learn how to do. So one of the things I'm not going to linger on as I go through the other slides, but that I definitely must start that. There is how the book adds a very well researched and coherently framed approach to public value theory, and lays out how it plays out in the field of pandemics and large-scale public health crises. We don't need a pandemic to resort to this theoretical framework. A large-scale public health crisis, an epidemic, a transnational outbreak of an infectious disease pose a lot of the same problems that pandemics do, as Dr. Chohan highlights throughout the book as well. The second thing that I would like to highlight, which I think is perfectly encapsulated in this expression, lives versus livelihoods, is something that probably is still very fresh in our collective and individual memories, because virtually every country on earth has experienced this dilemma. This divide, which I put the word apparent there, because I think one of the important contributions of the book is to explain how competing values sometimes can be reconciled, and sometimes there are ways to prioritize interventions when we have to cater to competing values. And again, public value theory is of help there. But I think Lives versus Livelihoods reminds each one of us here today of many of the dilemmas that we faced over the past 2.5 years. So public health is about preparedness and quick response and the articulation of competing stakeholders, which might be all in the same country at the domestic level or spread across borders. But we have to come quickly and make decisions that will impinge on individual freedoms and on the economy, trade, and the like. And I have more to say on this in just a moment, but there is what appears often to be a divide that cannot be reconciled. And one of the contributions of the book is to first explain how these two seemingly separate areas actually overlap and have to work together during a pandemic so that we don't bring the economy to a complete shutdown, but also as we curb disease, which again, we need to do and prepare to do in the future. The third thing I'd like to highlight is the role of transnational actors. The book has a case study on the World Health Organization. And I think one of the major contributions of this book is that it's one of the earliest in these early waves of scholarly contributions on a world that's now marked by misinformation and disinformation at a scale that we have not known before. Although misinformation and disinformation are not new phenomena, they are now via the internet and other digital tools being deployed in ways that we collectively are not familiar with historically, and these international or transnational actors now have to contend with that. And this is one of the first works in which I see that integrated into scholarly analysis. And then finally, the international / domestic conundrum. And by this, I mean that if we, for a moment, set aside some of the other things I've been discussing, which are international in nature, the response to disinformation about health, for instance, or about the pandemic, and this idea that the economy itself, it's not at this point realistic to be talking of just solely domestic economies. There's something to add to that in relationship at trade and economic level between countries. If we set that aside for a moment, there's still, and again, I'm a law professor, so my mind had to go there. There's still a problem of coordination between policies, politics even, and laws at the international level versus the domestic level, with actors often not cooperating as public health principles or economic principles, for that matter, would like them too. And this is yet another area that the book contributes to. So what I'm going to do in the time that I have left is to go through the three main bullet points. I don't have much to add in terms of public value theory, in which Dr. Chohan is certainly an expert, but I will share with you some of the thoughts that came to mind on the lives versus livelihoods, the role of transnational actors and international / domestic conundrum areas of the book. And again, this does not fully encapsulate everything that the book touches on, but some of the things that stood out to me, and I think to people with my background or working in these fields. On the topic of lives versus livelihoods, there's something that public value theory focuses on that resonates both in public health, but in other areas of law and policy. And this is the idea that we have competing values, we have objectives that in themselves are worth pursuing. We want a vibrant economy at the domestic level and at that transnational level, and we want healthy populations. So these are competing goals, and they're both good goals. So what happens when the worlds collide? And I'm using economy here to encapsulate the livelihood portion, as Dr. Chohan calls it, of this debate. So we want to prevent disease, the onset of disease, and we want to respond as efficiently as we can to the outbreak of disease. That's the lives part of the equation. And then we have what I call the economy or livelihoods in Dr. Chohan's words, but also think about trade, think about labor and other areas that are impacted by the imposition of the most stringent kind of public health measures, from complete shutdowns, which we experienced here in the United States, to restrictions on labor laws and what you can do in your workplace, or to commerce, right? For which businesses get to be open and for how long, how many restrictions we're going to place in terms of capacity and the like. So these are all things that under normal circumstances are legal to regulate, are desirable from a practical perspective, but they're clashing at this point, the imposition of public health measures and the economy. And I think one of the important points that the book does that I often don't see in scholarship, and some types of scholarship, I should say, is not only the characterization of the lives and the livelihoods portion of this puzzle, but also the idea that this is not really a divide, right? We tend to think of this as one or the other, or how much of one, how much of the other. But really, this is a false dichotomy, and the book makes a very important contribution there, because really these are interconnected areas of law, of policy, of politics, and of life in general, of living in a society collectively. So I think that's an extremely important contribution that the book makes, and I'm going to just add something on the law side of things, since that's my background, because I think the book underscores something that, if nothing else, law offers a proof of, and that's the idea that the laws and policies that we have historically passed to encourage things like biomedical innovation, so the laws that serve as incentives for companies and individuals to create new diagnostics, personal protective equipment, vaccines, and treatments, which broadly fall under the umbrella of intellectual property and patent law that reward innovation. These laws that are set at the international level and are adopted by virtually every country in the world, they're intellectual property laws. They regulate health goods. But when we pass things like the TRIPS agreement or the Doha Declaration on Public Health, which attaches to the TRIPS agreement, the intellectual property framework we all use, we attach that to trade laws. So the laws that were designed to incentivize the production of health goods, any type of health goods, from medicines to medical devices, if there's any problem regarding infringement of intellectual property, those are litigated through trade channels. The international IP agreement that you see highlighted here, the IP agreement that we call TRIPS, it's actually part of the World Trade Organization system, and it's administered by trade-related international organizations. So this is something that came to mind as I went through the book and the portion of the book in which Dr. Chohan dissected the different areas of lives and livelihoods that are affected by pandemics and large-scale epidemics. And I just wanted to offer this supporting idea that we know in international policymaking, if nothing else, that the two things are related, that a healthy world is actually not incompatible with more than that, has to be compatible with measures that are designed to keep our economies strong. And I think that moving forward, this suggests that we still need public health responses, and hopefully not just responses to public health crises, but also preparedness. So things we do to lessen the impact of future pandemics and epidemics, we have to prepare for those. They're going to come, they're going to be needed, but they have to be tailored, right? We want the least possible stringent form of public health intervention. And as long as we keep that need for tailoring in mind, I think we just have to go about our future lives thinking that these interventions are critical, not just to public health, but also to the economy, to trade, and to labor-related goals, because the COVID-19 pandemic certainly imposed a toll on all of these areas, which I'm calling economy here in the bottom, trade and labor, and Dr. Chohan called livelihoods. My second to last thought is on the role of transnational actors, and I'm going to be brief here for the sole reason that the case study on the World Health Organization that the book focuses on. I'm not going to comment on it. I'm currently a consultant to the World Health Organization. And this does not mean that I don't think that the organization itself has a whole lot to learn. I think it does. I think it has many things it can improve on, but I don't want to comment on it due to a current conflict of interests, but I highly recommend that you go through this case study. And I want to suggest that some of the findings in this portion of the book are actually applicable to other transnational actors, correct? Some of them slightly different in structure. So in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw CEPI and CTAP. CEPI is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, and CTAP is also a platform that brings together public-private actors, at the international level. So we had multiple types of international actors. Dr. Chohan focuses on an international organization, one that has a long history. And I want to suggest that a lot of these findings also are applicable to more recent transnational actors, and some of them that don't really take the form of a WHO or similar, but they might just be an international public-private partnership, as the two that I have highlighted here. And I also think that the findings of this case study are applicable to organizations operating in the public health space, even if there's no pandemic or epidemic. So CARB-X focuses on the production and allocation of medicines and other health goods needed to combat antimicrobial resistance. That's what the acronym stands for. And Gavi is a Geneva-based, like WHO, a Geneva-based vaccine, childhood vaccine procurement organization. So again, they're not exactly structured in the same way that an organization like the World Health Organization is, but they share many of the virtues, the coordinating virtues at the international level, and many of the faults of the World Health Organization. Because some of them are more gargantuan than others, they take some time to respond to the need that they need to face, simply because there's some degree of coordination that needs to be achieved. They need a certain degree of funding that's not necessarily always easy to guarantee. They're not exempt from politics, from the political economy, from controversy. We saw the US threatening to leave the World Health Organization during the pandemic. So I just want to suggest that what we read about in this case study is applicable elsewhere, and I would direct people at these organizations to read the book, and I'll be promoting this book widely also at that level. And I also want to say, as I did in the introduction, that these transnational organizations are are contending with a new phenomenon. And one of the things we know from the literature is that they're having some difficulty in responding to misinformation and disinformation. That's something that Dr. Chohan talks about quite a bit in the book, and it's again one of the first scholarly accounts of that phenomenon, because it's much easier and faster to promote health-related mis and disinformation than it is to verify data, produce a credible account, and disseminate it. So this is an emerging challenge that these organizations, not just the World Health Organization, have to contend with in the near future. And as the book also mentions, there's an accountability and transparency deficit at many of these organizations. It's not exclusive to the realm of public health, but it's something that the book draws attention to. And I think that's an important debate for, again, the World Health Organization and beyond. And then finally, I'll end with the international/domestic conundrum. A lot of the problems we see have to do with the fact that public health disease in general knows no physical or sovereign borders, and yet laws and policies really do operate across lines that were artificially drawn, sometimes with good reasons, sometimes perhaps not, but that's how they tend to operate. And this gives rise to the phenomenon of vaccine nationalism, which Chapter 5 focuses on. So the idea that countries are buying vaccines, and for that matter, other health goods, as any type of widget, any type of gadget, right? They're not buying them as health products per se, they're negotiating them as commodities. And Economics 101 dictates that the countries with the greatest purchasing power, and perhaps know-how in terms of repeat connections with the suppliers of these goods will always win vis-a-vis the countries that might have a greater public health need but don't have the same type of resources. And this ties to the phenomenon that Professor Halliby here in the US calls viral sovereignty. So this idea that, again, some of the things we might need to produce these vaccines and health goods might be available in a country, right? And some countries have tried to assert sovereignty, again, saying because this was found within my territory, I'm going to withhold these samples that might be needed to understand the disease or to produce a pharmaceutical product. So this is the other conundrum we're facing, and I personally have been working a lot in this area. And moving forward, we really need a way to negotiate the fair allocation of health goods. We've experienced that with vaccines in this pandemic and the previous pandemic, as Dr. Chohan describes in the book. And I dearly hope that we take to heart the things, the phenomena, the problems that Dr. Chohan surveys in the book. The account certainly offers a lot of food for thought, and I think this is a very important first step in getting a whole lot of different players, from mere law professors like me to people at these international organizations to society at large, to thinking about what we can do better the next time around. And we cannot do better if we don't understand what's happening on the ground during the pandemic and the epidemic. So thank you, Dr. Chohan, for writing this book. It was a pleasure to read it, and I hope to meet you in person at some point. But in the meantime, I will remain a fan of your work.